Before you say a single word, people are already reading you. They are noticing how you enter a room, how you carry your body, where your eyes go, how quickly you move, how you respond to silence, and whether your energy feels controlled or scattered. You may think respect begins with what you say, but often the first impression is created before your voice even enters the conversation. This is why mastering your presence is so important. You don't need to become louder. You don't need to look intimidating. You don't need to pretend you're more important than everyone else. In fact, trying too hard to appear powerful often communicates the opposite. Real presence comes from being comfortable enough with yourself that you don't need to perform. Look at the difference between someone who walks into a room seeking approval and someone who simply belongs there. The first person scans the room for reactions. They wonder who is watching. They adjust their behavior according to the people around them. They speak too quickly because they're afraid of losing attention. They laugh too much because they want acceptance. They constantly check whether others approve of them. The second person is different. They don't enter demanding attention. They enter grounded. Their movements are deliberate. Their posture is relaxed. Their eyes are present. They don't rush to fill every silence. They aren't constantly checking whether people are impressed. That calmness creates a psychological signal. This person is comfortable with themselves, and people notice comfort. Your posture is one of the simplest places to begin. Stand naturally. Keep your shoulders relaxed. Avoid shrinking your body when you're nervous. Don't constantly move your hands or shift your weight because you're uncomfortable with being observed. Slow down, take a breath, give yourself enough time to occupy your own space. You don't need exaggerated body language. You simply need to stop communicating nervousness through unnecessary movement. Then pay attention to your eyes. Eye contact doesn't mean staring at someone aggressively. It means being present enough to look at people when you speak and listen. When someone is talking to you, give them your attention instead of constantly looking around for something more interesting. That communicates respect. And ironically, when you give people genuine attention, they often become more comfortable giving you theirs. Your voice matters just as much. You don't need an artificial deep voice or an aggressive tone. You need control over your pace. Nervous people often rush. They speak quickly, they over-explain, they add unnecessary words because silence makes them uncomfortable. Slow down, let your sentences breathe, say what you mean, then stop. You don't need to immediately add another explanation just because the other person hasn't responded yet. Silence is not failure. Silence is space. A confident person can allow another person to think. They can listen without interrupting. They can disagree without becoming defensive. They can pause before answering difficult questions. This is where presence becomes more than body language. It becomes emotional control because your presence changes dramatically when people realize that you cannot easily be shaken. Someone challenges you, you remain calm. Someone disagrees, you listen. Someone criticizes you. You evaluate the criticism instead of instantly attacking. Someone tries to provoke you. You don't give them the reaction they expected. That doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It means you choose your response instead of surrendering control of it. This distinction is essential. Respect does not come from making people afraid of you. It comes from demonstrating that you can govern yourself. Anyone can become aggressive. Anyone can raise their voice. Anyone can make threats. But composure under pressure is much harder to fake, and people remember it. They remember the person who remained calm when everyone else became emotional. They remember the person who didn't need to dominate the conversation. They remember the person who could say something clearly and then remain silent. They remember the person who didn't chase attention. That is the beginning of a powerful reputation. But don't mistake presence for pretending to be mysterious. You don't need to act distant or cold. Genuine presence is about being fully engaged without being desperate. Be warm without being needy. Be confident without being arrogant. Be attentive without becoming submissive. Be calm without becoming passive. You are not trying to control the room. You are learning to control yourself inside the room. And once you master that, people begin experiencing something different when they interact with you. Your words carry more weight because your behavior supports them. Your confidence feels believable because you aren't constantly trying to prove it. But presence alone is only the beginning. The next step is removing the need to impress people at all, because the moment you stop performing for approval, your self-respect becomes much easier to see. The moment you stop trying to impress people, something changes in the way you carry yourself. You become lighter. You stop entering every conversation wondering whether people like you. You stop measuring your value through compliments, attention, or approval. And that is where genuine self-respect begins. Most people don't realize how much of their behavior is designed to create an impression. They talk about their achievements when nobody asked. They exaggerate stories. They agree with opinions they don't actually believe. They laugh at things they don't find funny. They constantly explain themselves because they are afraid someone might misunderstand their intentions. They think these behaviors make them more likable, but often they communicate insecurity. The person who desperately wants to be impressive is usually revealing that being accepted matters too much. You don't need to become cold or distant. You simply need to stop performing, walk into a conversation without needing to prove that you're interesting, speak without needing everyone to agree, share an achievement when it is relevant, but don't turn every interaction into a presentation about yourself. Let people discover your qualities through your behavior. This is a powerful psychological shift because respect grows when people sense that you aren't dependent on their reaction. Imagine telling someone about a goal you're working toward. They don't seem impressed. A validation-dependent person immediately starts explaining. They list everything they've accomplished. They try to convince the other person that the goal is important. A self-respecting person doesn't need to do that. They simply continue. Their goal doesn't become less meaningful because someone else didn't react enthusiastically. That is internal validation. And internal validation changes the way you make decisions. Instead of asking, will people approve of this? You begin asking, is this right for me? Instead of asking, will they think I'm successful? You ask, am I actually becoming successful? Instead of asking, do they think I'm attractive? You ask, do I take care of myself and carry myself with confidence? The questions move inward. That doesn't mean ignoring everyone. Feedback matters. Good advice matters. Other people's experiences can teach you things you cannot see yourself. But there is a difference between listening to feedback and living for approval. You can hear someone disagree with you without immediately changing your identity. You can consider criticism without allowing it to destroy your confidence. You can accept advice without surrendering your judgment. That is maturity. And people respect maturity because it feels stable. They know where you stand. They know you're not going to become a completely different person just because the room's opinion changes. This is also why you should stop over-explaining yourself. When you constantly justify every decision, you unintentionally communicate uncertainty. Sometimes a simple statement is enough. I can't do that. I'm not interested. That doesn't work for me. I've decided to go another direction. You don't always need a 5-minute explanation afterward. Of course, there are situations where explanation is appropriate, but don't confuse communication with begging to be understood. You are allowed to make reasonable decisions without getting universal approval. And the more comfortable you become with that reality, the stronger your presence becomes. You also need to stop comparing yourself constantly. Comparison creates an endless psychological trap. There will always be someone richer, someone more attractive, someone more successful, someone more talented, someone more experienced. If your confidence depends on being better than everyone around you, you will never feel secure. Instead, build your identity around progress. Ask yourself whether you're becoming stronger, wiser, more disciplined, more capable, and more emotionally stable than you were before. That comparison actually helps you because your confidence becomes connected to growth rather than competition, and growth gives you something external approval never can. Proof. You know what you've overcome, you know what you've learned, you know the discipline you've developed, you know the difficult moments you survived. Nobody else needs to validate those experiences for them to matter. This is why self-respect often looks quiet. You don't announce every boundary. You don't announce every achievement. You don't constantly remind people what you deserve. You simply behave according to your standards. And when your standards become consistent, people begin noticing. They realize you aren't desperate to be liked. You aren't easily pressured. You aren't constantly seeking attention. You can be friendly without becoming needy. You can be generous without becoming desperate for gratitude. You can be confident without becoming arrogant. You can be humble without becoming submissive. That balance is powerful because the goal isn't to make people think you're important. The goal is to become secure enough that you no longer need to convince them. And when you stop performing for approval, your words become more believable, your presence becomes more grounded, and your boundaries become easier to maintain. That leads naturally to the next level. Learning how to communicate with such clarity and calmness that people don't just hear your words, they feel the certainty behind them. The way you speak can determine whether people simply hear you or actually respect what you're saying. And this has very little to do with having the perfect vocabulary, the deepest voice, or the most impressive stories. It has much more to do with certainty. When your words come from a calm and grounded mind, people can feel the difference. Most people weaken their own communication without realizing it. They speak too quickly. They explain every detail. They apologize for harmless opinions. They turn simple statements into long defenses because they're afraid someone might disagree. They say, I think maybe we could possibly try this if you want. Compare that with, I think this is the better approach. The second statement carries more weight because it communicates a clear position without demanding agreement. That doesn't mean you should become rude or overly forceful. Confidence isn't about removing kindness from your communication. It's about removing unnecessary uncertainty. Say what you mean what you say, then allow other people to respond. You don't have to control their reaction. One of the most powerful communication habits you can develop is slowing down. When you're nervous, your mind wants to escape the moment. You rush through your sentences because silence feels uncomfortable. But when you slow your speech, you give your words room to land, pause before answering, think before reacting, let a sentence finish before adding another. A short pause can communicate more confidence than 10 extra words. This becomes especially important during disagreement. When someone challenges your opinion, the insecure instinct is to defend immediately. But you can say, I understand your point. I see it differently. That's enough. You don't need to turn every disagreement into a battle. If they ask why, explain your reasoning. If they disagree again, you can continue the conversation, but you don't need to become emotionally attached to winning. People often respect those who can disagree without becoming hostile. And listening is just as important as speaking. Insecure communicators often listen only long enough to prepare their next response. They're waiting for an opportunity to interrupt, correct, or redirect the conversation toward themselves. Confident communicators listen differently. They pay attention. They let people finish. They notice tone. They notice what isn't being said. They ask relevant questions when clarification is actually necessary. And they don't treat every conversation like a competition. That creates a strange psychological effect. People feel respected around you, and because they feel respected, they are more likely to respect you in return. You should also become comfortable with silence. Silence doesn't automatically mean rejection. It doesn't mean you've said something wrong. It doesn't mean you need to immediately entertain the other person. Sometimes people simply need a moment to think. Let them think. If you say something meaningful, don't destroy its impact by immediately adding 5 explanations. Say it, pause, let it exist. Another important habit is eliminating unnecessary apologies. If you make a genuine mistake, apologize. If you've hurt someone, take responsibility. But don't apologize for existing. Don't apologize for having reasonable standards. Don't apologize for disagreeing respectfully. Don't apologize simply because someone didn't like your answer. Constantly apologizing teaches your mind that your presence requires permission. It doesn't. You can be considerate without becoming submissive. You can be respectful without becoming weak. You can be direct without becoming aggressive. Your communication should reflect that balance. And never underestimate the power of consistency. If your words say one thing while your behavior repeatedly says another, people eventually stop believing you. You might say, I don't tolerate disrespect. But if you repeatedly accept the same behavior, your statement loses credibility. You might say, I'm serious about my goals. But if your actions constantly contradict that claim, people notice your communication becomes powerful when your behavior backs it up. That is why the strongest communication isn't just verbal. Your words, posture, timing, facial expression, and action should tell the same story. When they align, people experience you as predictable in the best sense. They know that your words mean something. They know that when you make a decision, you aren't likely to reverse it simply because someone pressures you. They know that when you say no, you mean no. They know that when you say yes, you're willing to follow through. That creates credibility. And credibility creates respect. But remember, the goal isn't to sound powerful. The goal is to become clear, because when your mind is clear, your communication becomes clear. When your emotions are controlled, your voice becomes calmer. When you respect yourself, you stop begging people to understand you. And when you can speak with calm certainty while still listening and respecting others, you create the foundation for something even stronger. boundaries that don't need anger to be taken seriously. Respect becomes much easier to maintain when people realize that your boundaries are not emotional threats. They are standards. You don't need to become aggressive to make your limits clear. You don't need to raise your voice, intimidate anyone, or create unnecessary conflict. In fact, the strongest boundaries are often communicated with the fewest words. Think about what happens when someone crosses a line and you immediately become emotional. You start explaining why their behavior was wrong. You argue, you repeat yourself, you demand that they understand. The conversation becomes longer and louder, but your position often becomes weaker because your emotions have taken control of the interaction. A stronger approach is simple. You identify the behavior. You communicate the standard, then you decide what action follows. If someone repeatedly speaks to you disrespectfully, you don't need a dramatic speech. You can calmly say, I won't continue this conversation if we're speaking to each other like this. Then follow through. That's the part most people miss. A boundary without action is only a request. If you say you won't tolerate something but repeatedly tolerate it, people learn that your words don't have consequences. Eventually, they stop taking your standards seriously. Your power doesn't come from what you threaten to do. It comes from what you consistently do. This is why boundaries require discipline. You may have to disappoint people. You may have to say no. You may have to leave a conversation. You may have to step back from someone you care about. And sometimes you may have to accept that enforcing your standards will cost you access to certain people. That can be uncomfortable. But ask yourself what costs more: temporarily losing someone's approval or permanently losing your self-respect. A person who respects themselves understands that not every relationship should be preserved at any price. You can care about someone and still tell them no. You can love someone and still refuse disrespect. You can respect someone and still disagree with them. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. That is emotional maturity. And when you communicate boundaries, don't over-explain them. The more you explain a reasonable boundary, the more opportunities you give someone to negotiate it. You say, I can't do that. They ask why. You explain. They challenge the explanation. You provide another explanation. Soon the conversation isn't about your decision anymore. It's about convincing the other person that your decision is valid. You don't need that. A healthy boundary doesn't require unanimous approval. Of course, there are situations where explanation is necessary. Relationships, workplaces, and important responsibilities sometimes require context and discussion, but explanation should serve communication, not desperation. You are not presenting a courtroom case for why you deserve basic respect. You are communicating a standard, and standards become powerful when they remain consistent. If you don't want people speaking over you, don't constantly allow interruptions. If you value your time, stop repeatedly accepting last-minute disrespect for your schedule. If you don't want to participate in gossip, don't join conversations that contradict that value. If you need space, communicate it instead of disappearing simply to punish someone. Your behavior teaches people how to interact with you. That doesn't mean blaming yourself for someone else's disrespect. Some people will cross boundaries regardless of how clearly you communicate, but your response determines whether their behavior gets continued access to your life. And this is where calmness matters again. A boundary delivered with anger can become a fight. A boundary delivered with calm certainty becomes information. You are saying, this is how I choose to be treated, and this is what I will do if that standard isn't respected. No threat, no performance, no revenge, just clarity. This also means learning to recognize when a boundary has been crossed accidentally versus intentionally. Not every mistake requires a dramatic response. Sometimes someone doesn't realize they interrupted you. Sometimes they misunderstood what you meant. Sometimes they made a mistake and genuinely correct it when you mention it. Give reasonable people room to adjust. But repeated behavior after clear communication tells you something different. At that point, the boundary isn't about changing them. It's about changing your participation. You don't have to force someone to respect you. You simply control their access to you. That is a much more powerful position, because the moment you stop trying to control other people's behavior and start controlling your own response, and you become harder to manipulate, and eventually people notice something important about you. Your kindness has standards, your words have consequences, And your presence is not something you can treat carelessly. That creates credibility. And once your boundaries are backed by real competence and reliability, respect becomes something people experience rather than something you have to demand. Respect that lasts is rarely created by appearance alone. Presence may make people notice you, your communication may make them listen, and your boundaries may make them understand your standards. But lasting respect comes from one thing: becoming genuinely competent and reliable. Because eventually people test what they see. They may hear you speak confidently, but can you actually solve problems? They may notice your calmness, but can you stay composed when responsibility becomes heavy? They may hear you talk about discipline, but can you keep your promises when nobody is checking? This is where real authority separates itself from performance. You don't need to convince people that you're capable. Become capable. Develop skills that are useful. Learn how to communicate clearly. Learn how to make decisions under pressure. Learn how to manage your time. Learn how to solve problems instead of constantly complaining about them. Learn how to stay dependable when circumstances become inconvenient. Every ability you develop adds weight to your presence. Think about someone who enters a difficult situation and immediately begins looking for solutions. They don't need to announce that they're a leader. Their behavior demonstrates it. When something goes wrong, they don't panic. They don't immediately blame someone else. They assess the situation. They ask what needs to be done. Then they act. People naturally respect that kind of person because competence creates trust. And trust is one of the foundations of respect. This is why you should stop obsessing over looking powerful and start becoming useful. Looking powerful can create an impression for a few minutes. Being useful creates a reputation over years. Anyone can speak confidently. Not everyone can deliver. Anyone can promise. Not everyone follows through. Anyone can tell people what they intend to accomplish. Very few people consistently complete what they start. Become one of those people. If you tell someone you'll handle something, handle it. If you make a commitment, take it seriously. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it and correct it. If you don't know something, learn it instead of pretending. These behaviors may seem ordinary, but they create extraordinary credibility. And credibility changes how people treat you. They know that your words aren't empty. They know that when you say something, there is a reasonable chance you will actually do it. They know that when a problem appears, you won't immediately disappear. They know that you can be trusted with responsibility. That is powerful. But competence also requires humility. A person who thinks they already know everything eventually becomes predictable and weak. The confident person remains teachable. They can listen to someone younger. They can learn from someone less experienced in other areas. They can admit when their original idea was wrong. They can change their approach when better information appears. That doesn't reduce authority. It strengthens it, because people respect someone who is secure enough to learn. You should also understand that competence isn't about becoming perfect. You will make mistakes. You will sometimes make poor decisions. You will sometimes fail. The difference is what happens afterward. An insecure person protects their ego. They blame circumstances. They blame other people. They pretend the failure never happened. A confident person studies the failure. What went wrong? What did I miss? What skill was missing? What should I change next time? Then they improve. Every failure becomes part of their education. Every difficult experience adds another layer of capability. And over time, that capability becomes visible. People may not know every struggle you went through, but they notice the result. They notice that you're prepared. They notice that you stay calm. They notice that you don't need constant supervision. They notice that your decisions have thought behind them. They notice that you don't collapse when something unexpected happens. That is how respect becomes natural. And there is another side to competence that many people ignore: consistency. Being impressive once means very little. Being reliable repeatedly means everything. One successful project doesn't establish a reputation. One good conversation doesn't establish character. One confident decision doesn't establish leadership. Bertals do. Your behavior repeated over time tells people who you are. So become predictable in your standards. Be the person who arrives prepared. Be the person who keeps their word. Be the person who doesn't betray their principles when pressure appears. Be the person who becomes more capable instead of more bitter after setbacks. Eventually, people won't need to ask whether you're serious. Your history will answer for you. And that is the kind of respect you should pursue. Not fear, not forced obedience, and not temporary admiration, but the quiet recognition that you are someone whose presence, judgment, and contribution genuinely matter. When you become competent and reliable, you no longer need to demand respect. You create reasons for people to give it. Eventually, you reach a point where you understand something most people spend years learning. You cannot force someone to respect you. You can demand it, threaten for it, argue for it, or constantly try to prove yourself worthy of it. But genuine respect cannot be extracted through pressure. It is created through the way you govern yourself. That is the final level of this psychology. You stop asking, how do I make them respect me? And you start asking, how do I become someone who respects himself so completely that disrespect no longer controls his behavior? That question changes everything, because when your self-respect depends on other people's reactions, you become vulnerable. Someone ignores you and you chase them. Someone criticizes you and you become defensive. Someone withdraws their attention and you start trying harder to earn it back. But when your self-respect comes from within, your behavior becomes different. You can hear criticism without immediately collapsing. You can experience rejection without begging someone to reconsider. You can lose someone's approval without losing your identity. You can walk away from disrespect without needing revenge. That is freedom, and freedom creates presence. You have to understand that not everyone will respect you. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will dislike your standards. Some will become uncomfortable when you stop being as available as you once were. Let them. Your responsibility isn't to control everyone's opinion. Your responsibility is to control your conduct. This doesn't mean becoming arrogant or believing you're above everyone. In fact, genuine self-mastery makes arrogance unnecessary. You can respect other people's opinions without surrendering your own judgment. You can listen without obeying. You can disagree without becoming hostile. That balance is powerful. You become difficult to manipulate because your emotional state isn't constantly waiting for someone else's permission. And this is where detachment becomes important. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You can care about a relationship without being terrified of losing it. You can appreciate someone's presence without believing you cannot live without it. You can value someone's opinion without making it the final authority over your life. You can love people without abandoning yourself to keep them. That is mature confidence. And when someone repeatedly disrespects you, you don't have to create a dramatic confrontation every time. Sometimes the strongest response is simply reducing access. Less attention, less availability, less emotional investment, less explanation, not as punishment, as a consequence. Your time and energy are valuable resources. You should not give unlimited access to people who repeatedly demonstrate that they don't know how to handle them responsibly. But remember, boundaries only work when you enforce them consistently. If you tell someone that a certain behavior is unacceptable and then continue rewarding that behavior with your attention, you teach them that your words have no weight. So let your actions speak. If a conversation becomes disrespectful, end it. If someone repeatedly violates your boundaries, create distance. If a relationship constantly destroys your peace, reconsider your participation. If someone doesn't value your contribution, stop trying to convince them of your value. You don't need to announce your departure with anger. You don't need to make them jealous. You don't need to create a performance designed to make them regret losing you. Just move forward. There is enormous power in leaving quietly because you have nothing left to prove. And this is where everything from the previous lessons comes together. Your presence is calm because you no longer need approval. Your communication is clear because you trust your judgment. Your boundaries are strong because you respect yourself. Your competence gives your confidence substance. Your emotional control keeps you from reacting impulsively. And your self-mastery allows you to walk away without losing yourself. That combination creates something people naturally recognize: authority, not the authority of someone who demands attention, but the authority of someone who knows their own value. You don't have to enter every room trying to establish dominance. You don't have to win every disagreement. You don't have to correct every person who misunderstands you. You don't have to respond to every insult. You don't have to prove that you're powerful. Your consistency does the talking. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: don't build your personality around getting respect instantly. Build your character so strongly that respect becomes a natural consequence of how you live. Be calm, be clear. Be competent, be reliable, be selective, be willing to say no, be willing to walk away, be willing to admit when you're wrong, be willing to keep growing when nobody applauds you. Because the person who truly masters themselves doesn't spend their life demanding that other people recognize their worth. They know it, and that knowledge changes the way they speak, move, choose, and live. When you no longer need to beg for respect, you finally become capable of carrying yourself in a way that makes your presence difficult to ignore.